Hello everyone, this is Eric, the Asian movie enthusiast. So we're about to dive into Asian horror movies from 1999. This is a good year we're about to explore. Of the 19 films I'm going to cover, I enjoyed 14 of them. Overall, I'd have to say that I enjoyed 1999 more than 1998. But are any of these movies as good as Ringu or Whispering Corridors? Yes, in fact, there are at least two titles that are in that elite class, and we will cover those in part 2 of this video. Now, part 1 here will cover a few underwhelming flicks, but we'll also touch upon some pretty good ones as well, so we don't have to wait for part 2 to get into some interesting stuff. So that's good. It's another sign this year is a bit of an improvement overall. But first, I have some honorable mentions, of course. Now remember, these are movies that some people classify as horror films, but I do not. Some excellent honorable mentions for 1999 are Gemini, directed by Shinya Tsukamoto, and Charisma, directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa, both Japanese films, which are highly recommended by yours truly. Some good honorable mentions are Tell Me Something from South Korea and Black House from Japan. Now there are no honorable mentions, or dishonorable mentions, I guess, for films that I have disliked as of yet. So that's a good thing, but that will change in subsequent years. So let's get started here. And as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss are listed in the description box below. And we start with what I believe to be the single worst Asian horror film from 1999, and that is Girl Hell, 1999. Now in this film, a teenage schoolgirl interacts with some degenerates, her deformed sister and her abusive father, in this film by Daisuke Yamanouchi. Alright, now Daisuke here is a fairly popular exploitation director. His most popular works were released near the turn of the century, and we will cover some of them in the next few videos. Our protagonist in Girl Hell 1999 lives a fairly awful life. Her sister is sexually abused by her father, her only friend is a down-and-out prostitute, and the few men that she's able to befriend turn out to be revolting fellows. So this sounds like the recipe for some nasty entertainment, but this is surprisingly boring, unfortunately. There's no reason for a 66-minute long movie to be dull, but Girl Hell 1999 certainly is. There's actually a lot of dull filler. I mean, for a 66-minute movie, it just felt like there was a lot of static content here that you kind of had to slug through. That is a problem, of course, because none of the character interaction here is particularly interesting. It's fairly shallow stuff. Yeah, there is some degenerate behavior, mostly rape, but it's portrayed in somewhat annoying ways. So not only is it uninteresting, but it's kind of obnoxious. The scenes involving breast milk, in particular, are very, very stupid, in my opinion. So this film just got on my bad side. I do not recommend it. There's not a whole lot here to see. You know, there's some disgusting stuff in there, but, I don't recommend this. Now, the next film tonight that we will be covering is Tomie, Another Face, a Japanese horror anthology film. Now, this is actually the second film in the Tomie series, which concerns a mysterious, almost demonic girl who cannot die. Now, this is yet another instance where we have two Asian horror films from the same franchise that were released during the same year. We saw this when we covered Troublesome Night 1 and 2, both of which were released in 1997, Troublesome Night 3 and 4, both of which were released in 1998, and Ringu and Raisin, both of which were also released in 1998. Now we have Tomie and Tomie Another Face, both of which were released in 1999. But since Tomie Another Face is the less impressive of the two, we will cover that one here and save the superior original for part 2. I'm also going to go into a little bit more depth into the concept of Tomie when I review the original film in the next video, but what you need to understand for this review is that the antagonist here is a girl who cannot die. but has a psychological power of sorts that turns people against one another, often resulting in brutal murders. Kind of an interesting premise. This installment in the franchise distinguishes itself because it consists of 3 separate short stories. Most of the Tomie films are not anthologies, so this is an exception. But unfortunately, none of these stories are particularly good. Also, this was a production that was direct-to-video, so it looks and feels rather cheap, resulting in the cheesiest film of the franchise, up to this point at least, in the early installments. The Tomie character here is also humanized a lot more than some of the other films in the franchise, and she acts almost like a normal teenager, which significantly reduces her creepiness. As another negative, the scoring is kind of embarrassing in spots. It's not good. It's pretty low-grade stuff. I did not like the music in this at all. You're just better off avoiding this one. You may want to check out some of the ones that I recommend first in this franchise, and then visit this one later if you become a fan of those movies. So, I do not recommend Tomie Another Face. So now we're moving from the pretty bad films to the mediocre ones, but they're films that I do not necessarily like. So we haven't gotten to the good stuff yet, so bear with me. Now this film does get mixed reviews online, and that is Embalming from Japan. Now, after a dead boy's head is stolen, an embalmer investigates in this film by Shinji Aoyama. Now, Aoyama's filmography is rather hit and miss, in my opinion. His best film is still Eureka from 2000, which was a really good art house drama. Unfortunately, he seems to be back on his, or I should say fortunately, he seems to be back on his game with the recent film Backwater from 2013, which I enjoyed. So hopefully he can continue his momentum with future titles. Unfortunately, though, I find Embalming to be one of Aoyama's weaker films. Now, I looked up the plot synopsis online recently, and I honestly did not remember any of the specifics from when I had seen this from the first time, which is never a good thing. Whenever you hear me say I don't remember anything about a movie that I saw, even years ago, it's not a good sign. So, the story is actually more convoluted than you might believe. You might expect the entire film to revolve on one or a few dead bodies that the embalmer is, I guess, preparing, and the stories behind those 1 or 2 dead bodies. But this movie bites off more than it can chew, and ultimately nothing becomes memorable. The opening half did show some promise, with some detailed embalming sequences, a decent premise to start, and some moody camera work. So it starts off pretty good, but by the second half, you're stuck with a mostly boring detective investigation with a mystery component that is simply not interesting at all to watch. Some critics, though, enjoyed this movie quite a bit, but I personally found Embalming to be less thought-provoking than what I was led to believe going into it. So, I don't recommend this one. However, if you read a few other reviews online and you like what they have to say, check it out sometime, but I cannot recommend this. Next film here is another Japanese horror film. It's 4 in a row. And that is Japanese Hell, which is, of course, a Japanese horror film. Now, bad guys do bad things here, and then get tortured in hell after they die. That's the basic premise. Now, we already reviewed a film with a similar premise to this when we covered Jigoku from 1960. Now, this film, Japanese Hell, is directed by Teruo Ishii, the man who brought us The Joys of Torture and the Horrors of Malformed Men. Now, the people in this film who get sent to hell are basically child molesters or crazy cult leaders, but the protagonist is actually a young human woman who is granted limited access to hell. She gets a special pass, behind-the-scenes pass, so that she can observe what awaits her if she doesn't amend her ways. So the first part of this movie is basically cheesy fun, so to speak, but things really do kind of drag during the lengthy middle section that deals with the cult leader and his followers. Nothing engaging happens, and there's a bunch of gratuitous, boring sex scenes tossed into this middle section. So it just kind of took me out of the film completely during the entire middle section of this film. The final section improves again and gets back to the cheesy torture fun. There is one tongue scene that is particularly outrageous. But by that time, the film's enjoyment had already been harmed beyond repair. So, you start off pretty good, then you have this long stretch of just boring filler, and then you end off pretty good. But overall, I found this to be pretty mediocre stuff. I do not recommend it. Alright, the next one here is one of the more popular ones we're going to discuss in this video, and that is The Ring Virus, a South Korean horror film. Now this South Korean, it's basically a remake of Ring-U, is lesser in every respect, despite the fact that everything plays out in a very similar fashion. So this is one of those films that I had to rewatch fairly recently when preparing for this YouTube project, because again, I literally remembered nothing about it. Like literally nothing about this movie. I couldn't even remember like one scene out of it. Now, I did see it, in all fairness, I saw it about 10 years ago, but when I rewatched it recently, I completely understood why nothing stood out. So this is a very monotonous film that is lacking in bite. There's something missing to this. It doesn't have any like true intensity to it. It's very lethargic in how it goes about things, and it's very run-of-the-mill. I mean, you basically get the same plot here that concerns the grainy, enigmatic videotape that has the power to kill people 7 days after they watch it. But the videotape footage itself in Ring Virus is so grainy at times that you can't really see much of anything that's on it, which was kind of a weird artistic choice from the filmmakers. And the stuff that you can see is kind of ineffective and uninteresting and not particularly creepy. The big scene, not to spoil anything, near the end of the film is decent, but it's not a spot on any of the other any of the better Ring-U films, I should say, in terms of horror elements. So in terms of scare tactics here, this one's a big downgrade from the original film and even some of its sequels or prequels. On a positive note, though, the performances are adequate here, but nothing particularly impressive. Now, when looking at the cast list, you may see Doona Bae's name, who's a very popular South Korean actress nowadays, but don't be fooled if you're a fan of hers, because she plays the long-haired villain in this movie, so you probably won't even recognize her, and she doesn't get much screen time. So if you're a fan of Doona Bae and you're like, ooh, I'll watch this film because of her, you may be disappointed. But even if you're a fan of the Japanese Ring franchise, Ring Virus really doesn't offer much of anything. You will completely forget about this within a few days of watching it, as I did. So I would say stick to the Japanese versions. But luckily now, we are transitioning into Asian horror films from 1999 that are a bit more enjoyable. We're not up to the creme de la creme by any means, but we're starting to get into films that have enough positives that outweigh the negatives. And the first film here is a fairly obscure Hong Kong film called The Mirror, which is a Hong Kong horror anthology. Now, this is a trilogy of tales, approximately 30 minutes each, centered on a cursed mirror from the Ming Dynasty. Now, in the first story, which is set in 1922 Shanghai, an heiress to a large mansion is given an antique dressing table by her cousin as a birthday gift. Now, the young woman thinks terrible things are happening to her when she brushes in front of the mirror, but this could be justified retribution for events that occurred in her past. Now, I like this one, and it's the best segment, in my opinion. It just has a good overall quality to it. Now, in the second segment, which is basically a horror comedy set in the 1980s, Singapore 1980s, during the Ghost Festival, a good-natured attorney becomes immoral after looking into the mirror. So this story concerns the concept of greed and does a pretty good job of portraying that. It's watchable fluff, I think. Not as good as the first story, but it's decent. Then in the third story, which is set in 1999 Hong Kong, a student played by Nicholas Tse, who's a very popular actor, purchases the mirror in an antique shop, which results in some strange occurrences. Most unfortunately, this final segment is very dumb and has an overall low quality that really brings the whole quality of the anthology down. It's hard to explain, but the way things play out are very eye-rolling and hokey, real corny stuff. The final death scene is particularly eye-rolling. Now, I do think that the first two segments of this anthology make it worth a watch, but the mirror is not a high priority item by any means, so if you can't find it, don't be too concerned. But the one interesting thing I noticed while looking at my notes here is that, this is an anthology where you have each story in a different time period in a different location. So that's kind of interesting. But, not a high priority item. Now, the availability, the mirror is difficult to find. I think this is one of those ones that I rented, I think from eHit or something, like years ago, before that website eventually went away. So, this is one that it's going to be difficult to find. But don't worry if you can't find it. It's not something to worry about. But if you happen to come across it, check it out. The next film here is Troublesome Night 5, Hong Kong horror comedy anthology. Now, 3 characters experience supernatural phenomena in this anthology of linked tales. The first story is about a taxi driver who meets some ghoulish customers, like a gang boss, a fake ghost, a mysterious old woman, an edgy lady, so to speak, and a real ghost. So this is the most entertaining segment of the bunch, with a nice mix of creepiness and humor. In the second story, a gambler, played by series regular Louis Koo, of course, and his family move into a new house, which turns out to be haunted, of course. But in this case, the ghosts actually help the protagonist to make money. In this kind of situation, however, bad things could happen, and you could probably guess that they do. This one's pretty good, despite being somewhat predictable. So, not bad. In the third story, a man sees ghosts during his night shift. This is the weakest tale of the anthology, with an overly nervous, group of cops and a fairly dull pace. So overall, this actually kind of mirrors, pun intended, the mirror that we just covered. You have a good first segment, pretty good second segment, kind of shaky third segment. But Troublesome Night 5 has that whitish blue lighting that is very specifically used in some Hong Kong ghost films from the turn of the century. So it's kind of nice, and it adds a bit of mood to all of the stories. So Troublesome Night 5 is not as good as, say, Troublesome Night 3, but it's certainly more watchable than Troublesome Night 1 or 4. And it's probably on par with Troublesome Night 2. So, you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, didn't Eric say in a previous video that this Troublesome Night franchise is more miss than hit? It seems like the majority of these early installments are pretty decent. And yes, that is correct. But you'll see after we cover Troublesome Night 6 in our next video that it's all downhill from there. So availability of Troublesome Night 5, I couldn't find a readily available DVD, but it is available on YouTube for streaming. Now the next film here is an obscure one that few people know about, but I think it's kind of interesting. And that is Scary Fairy Tales, Kawaii Doa Thumbelina, also known as The Thumb Princess, a Japanese horror comedy. Now this direct-to-video film is about a schoolgirl who is obsessed with one of her male classmates. So she gets a magic potion that shrinks the dude down to size. Then she imprisons him in her desk drawer. kind of a macabre premise. And the lead actress here is Chiaki Kuriyama, who is most popular in the West for her role as Gogo Yubari in Kill Bill. But she's also appeared in some other popular Japanese movies, such as Battle Royale, Hair Extensions, and the recent Library Wars films. But this Thumbelina movie has, it's got poor special effects. The budget is really low, so the special effects are pretty bad here. And the script is actually kind of weak, I have to admit. But Kuriyama gleefully plays a psycho, and it's fun to watch her torment miniature people. So that's what makes it watchable. Kind of an odd scenario watching Chiaki Kuriyama torment miniature people. There are some funny WTF moments, but there are also some dumb moments to endure. Kind of a mixed bag here in this film, but I still think it's worth a watch just to see how bizarre it is. To modern day viewers, this is almost like a demented version of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, but I think it's actually inspired by a literary fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen that was first published in the 1800s in Copenhagen, Denmark, the home of Soren Kierkegaard, I believe. So the original story was very different, however, with the only similarity being a person in miniature size. So, this one, I liked it, mostly because of Chiaki Kuriyama acting psychotic to miniature people. But, tread lightly. Tread carefully. Now, this obscure film that very few people have heard about is available on YouTube for viewing. I think it's segmented, though, so you'll have to find the playlist. But once you find the playlist, it'll play all the parts, I think. So you might be in luck on this one if you want something a little weird and different, low budget, and obscure. Alright, so we move on here. Do we have 2 films left here? Yes, we do. Alright. Get 2 films left. Now this next film is Shikoku, a Japanese horror drama hybrid. Now a woman returns to her hometown and begins to investigate the ghostly occurrences related to her friend who died years ago. Now the atmosphere here is expressed through beautiful natural environments, expert lighting, and soundtrack, and it's very nice stuff. There's also much cultural value in the emphasis on desolate Japanese village life and shaman ceremonies. Now in real life, the island of Shikoku is associated with a multi-site pilgrimage of 88 temples, and that pilgrimage does have a contribution within the plot of this film. So you have some cultural value here and some interesting things to contemplate, I guess. Now in terms of scare tactics, there are no jump scares present, which is a big positive for me personally, because jump scares, can get pretty lazy and cheap at times. So you don't have to worry about that here. But this is not a particularly scary film, so don't go in expecting to be terrified either. One problem lies in the fact that the pacing is a bit too slow for its own good during that middle section. And the ending is also oddly laid back and a bit of an anticlimax, but I think it does suit the film, and the way the film progresses, it's just kind of it feels like a logical conclusion to everything to me. But I have seen a lot of online reviewers complain that the ending was not like a big climactic finish, you know what I mean? Now, Chiaki Kuriyama shows up in this film as well, but she's not in the film very long, similar to Duna Bay in Ring Virus. So if you're watching this film just for her, you may be disappointed. And I think on the DVD cover, they might showcase Chiaki Kuriyama on the DVD cover, but if you're using that as your guide, just be wary, because she's not in the film long. So Shikoku overall gets very mixed reviews on the internet, but I personally enjoy it, and I think I enjoyed it quite a bit more after a second viewing. I think I was expecting more of a visceral horror, like Ringu, where you really get some scenes that shake you up. This film isn't like that. It's almost a bit relaxing, which is odd for a horror film, but I don't know, I liked it because it felt a little bit different. So, it's one to check out if you're in the mood for kind of a moody, cultural horror flick. So DVD availability of Shikoku is that it's moderately available on DVD. It used to be widely available, but it's one of those situations where you can get it, but I think you might have to get it used. Or if it's new, the price will vary. So our last film tonight is a fairly grimy and notorious one, and that is Red Room, Japanese exploitation horror drama hybrid. So in this film, 4 people agree to enter the Red Room to play a dare game in which the winner is awarded $100,000. Now the premise seems to be aimed at mocking the ridiculousness of reality television by taking it to the next level. Now what do I mean by next level? Well, we're talking about a sick little Japanese movie, so you could probably guess. The tasks become more disgusting and perverted as things progress. There's not a lot of graphic gore here, which is a surprise given this film's reputation, but there is plenty of nasty, uncomfortable, violent content that will likely offend mainstream viewers. This movie does a good job at situational horror, where you as a viewer become distressed by imagining yourself in this particular situation and having these acts inflicted upon you. Now in terms of acting, I think the male lead is a bit on the irritating side, but the ladies do a little bit of a better job with their performances. Nothing great here, but it's acceptable overall, I think. The budget is almost non-existent here. It's basically filmed in one location. And our good friend Daisuke Yamanouchi is the director. But I find this to be an oddly compelling film, and it has enough to keep the viewer's attention for its lean 68 minutes. Now, Yamanouchi's films tend to be very low budget and mean-spirited, which will be an obvious turnoff for some viewers, but if you're familiar with this director, then you'll know what to expect. So I think this is a decent one. If you're not familiar with Yamanouchi, this is a decent one to look for. Now, the availability of Red Room, it is widely available on DVD. I looked on Amazon, it seems to be well stocked. So that's it for part 1 of our exploration of Asian horror from 1999. We do have one of our first unimpressive Ring knockoff films in Ring Virus, which is an unexpected consequence of Ring's popularity. But we've also touched upon, a handful of decent movies here that may be worth your time depending on your tastes. So be sure to check out part 2 of this video, where we will cover some of the better Asian horror films from this year. And as always, we'll see you next time.